Greetings, welcome to Powered by Nyame. I'm your guide and host, Kwesi Kunadu. On this episode, our focus will be on some essential questions for our times. Now, these questions have been asked and answered before. However, over time, the cast members, that is, the human beings that were in a previous era, obviously they disappear. That is, they either vanish into the ether or they transition in some shape or form, which means even though the question had been asked before, it matters to a different set of cast members, a different set of people. And so in our time, I'm going to ask essential questions that will relate to these times and provide some responses that will fit or match, the times that we're living in. Now, I'm going to start with a premise. The premise is this: we are not alone. By that I mean this. I mean that we human beings exist alongside a host of other beings, creatures, forces, figures, whatever you want to call it. And these kinds of beings, they differ from us human beings in shape, size, form, look, or appearance, and composition, meaning what they're made of, what they're built of, or built from. And so that's the premise. Now, that seems very much common sense and not even necessary to state, but I want to build upon that. So I'm going to scaffold or build upon that premise in this episode. So let's get started. One of the questions that continue to be asked that I want to contextualize and then, of course, address it. And this is the question about religion and spirituality, specifically the existence of a thing or a force called God, right? Now, context. Over recent years, perhaps the last decade or two, whether in Europe or the United States, there have been a decline, a steep decline in church attendance as one metric or measure for religiosity. And therefore, there's also a movement towards, the kinds of membership to atheists or agnostic or other kinds of group that essentially deny or reject or simply say that, this idea of God doesn't exist, or this thing called God doesn't exist, right? Or it's not important to us. And so here is the answer to that question. The answer is pretty simple. Of course, God or Creator or Almighty or a force of that magnitude has to exist if we exist. In other words, human beings don't beget themselves. That's first and foremost. Secondly, our body and our body rhythms is automated. In other words, I don't have to force myself to breathe. I automatically breathe. I don't have to force my heart to pump blood throughout the body and receive it in turn. And of course, that blood carries oxygen and as well as nutrients to the rest of the body to feed it, to keep us human beings alive. Almost all the major processes that occur within the body are automation, meaning they happen without us, independent of us. So there must be a force or some kind of energy regulating that is not us, right? The second or third sort of response, to that is think about those people who, again, either deny or reject the idea of existence of a God or creator. And here is, another response to that, which I think is often overlooked, which is that essentially what we have in this world, this universe, this cosmos, are basically two elemental forces, almost like a light switch. Or for you computer science nerd like I was when I was an undergrad before turning to history, it's a binary code, meaning 0, for off and 1 for on. So if you go to your, common light switch in your home or your apartment, you will see that there's an off and on switch. 1 0 1 0. It's binary code, off and on. The same is true for the cosmos. There are two elemental forces. There are what we refer to as, negative current or charges in the case of a battery or the kind of energy that may power your vehicle or your home. And there's a positive charge. The same is true for spiritual forces and beings. That there's a group or a crop of those that are negative forces, and there are positive forces, right? And you can look at a battery, and at the head of the battery, usually the positive charge, and the tail or the end of the battery is a negative charge, right? And so those same forces exist on a more massive scale in a way that we can't apprehend with our human eye, unless, of course, you have the ability to do so. Nonetheless, the point I'm getting at is that Of course, therefore God is real because those forces are real and we rely upon them, right? Either for our automobiles, our homes, and everything we do, our computers, our gadgets, our devices depend upon these two forces working, right? Essentially, this God in the form of the elements that make up our batteries, that make up our energy sources, whether it's wind, solar, or otherwise, comes from a force, a source, right? A- i.e., God, right? And of course, there are others who doubt, and so they ask other questions. Well, if God existed or the Creator existed, why is there wickedness in the world? Well, guess what? Why is there truth in the world? Well, truth exists because the lies exist. And so, in other words, you have to have, again, the binary or the converse of something that exists. And so we know what truth is because lies exist. So we need lies to exist. Likewise, we need wickedness to exist to really know what goodness and virtue and purity and all the other good stuff is. In other words, one essentially co-defines the other. One sort of makes clear, sort of pulls away the mask or veil to make clear the other thing. And so, because one exists, it clarifies the existence of the other. And so, if we simply just have goodness, then we would know what wickedness is. In fact, we would know what goodness is because we just have one thing, right? In other words, if we didn't have water, then, what would we know? Another kind of liquid, perhaps, maybe milk. But again, milk comes from the animal, or sometimes whether it's rice or almond, it comes from a source that actually consumed water, right? So if you break it down to its most elemental parts, right, you can't escape the fact that um, this presence of a God or God force, right, it's so ubiquitous, less ironically and even counterintuitively, many of us deny it, reject it, when it's right in front of us, when we can't exist without it, right? Even the very machines called life support that keeps us alive runs on energy that we don't create, that comes from, we say, nature. But what is nature but the forces that uphold the natural order, i.e. God, right? So any way you break it down to its most, elemental part or common denominator, it's still there. Yet these people also ask, well, okay, I get that maybe for wickedness, but what about slavery, right? And they're referring to, the most recent iteration of it. Of course, slavery has been around for a long time as both a process, an enterprise, and an institution, right? And so the most recent form, it has to do with people of African ancestry, not solely, but certainly, most poignantly, particularly in places like Western Africa, West Central Africa, Western Europe, Central Europe, and of course, United States and the rest of the Americas, Caribbean Basin included. And I said, well, why did God allow slavery to happen? Well, let's break this down again. Think about it this way. The vast majority of enslaved Africans, and I'll give you a number to work with, we have records for at least 13 million Africans that were forcibly removed from their homelands. That is from Senegambia all the way down to West Central Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope in Southern Africa, and South Africa, proper, to, as around the Cape of Good Hope, around to Southeast Africa, around the Mozambique, Madagascar region, Madagascar being the largest island off the Southeast African coast. So that catchment area right there, over roughly 4 centuries plus, right? And you have 13 million at least recorded, right? Which, of course, the numbers don't account for those that were undocumented. But beginning with that number, what you have is that vast majority of the people that were sent on a one-way voyage from their homelands were usually prisoners of war, right? Different kinds of war. War for territory, war for conquest, and therefore annexation, and under a sovereign power that is a larger polity or state or empire. And of course, religious wars. Wars that are fought between Christians and Muslims, and Christians and Muslims fight against indigenous people who are neither of those religious faith. And so, whatever the impetus for the war, prisoners of war, the vast majority of folks came as prisoners of war. Now, who were leading and sponsoring those wars? Well, one of the forces from the coastal area was European capital. That is the offer of trade goods, liquor, rum, brandies, vodkas, you name it, as well as everything from clothing, blankets, cloth, bed sheets, top hats, jackets, to the symbolic paintings of European, emperors or rulers, canes, as well as materials, for example, copper or brass, which is of course an alloy, and other kinds of trade goods, right? And so these trade goods, which had value, were then essentially offered on credit, and that credit, of course, puts you in debt, and of course, satisfy that debt. The primary, commodity were captured people, right? So raiding as well as warring accounted for a vast majority, perhaps 2/3 or more, of the enslaved Africans that found their way to the Americas between 1500 and 1900, right? That's 4 centuries. Now, because the sponsors of those wars are much smaller, we can identify them. Essentially, everything from these joint, stock exchange and companies based in Europe, major cities like London, Liverpool, Antwerp in Northern Europe, Lisbon in Portugal, Seville and Cordoza in Spain, Bordeaux, Nantes in France, and so on and so forth. So these major European metropoles or urban centers, and the capital extended from the metropoles to fund and build the slave ships and fund the voyages, to pay the crew and captain, of course, to in turn get the goods made by the enslaved, the rum, the molasses, cotton, tobacco, cacao, that's cocoa, cotton that used to make fabrics, and linens and everything else. All those things were in the cycle, right? So you have basically a small amount of people. What drove those people? Greed. Greed, right? What is greed? Greed is a spirit, right? It's a negative spirit. It's a demonic spirit. Greed will destroy the person harboring or hosting the greed, and it'll destroy anything in the midst of that person wielding or using that greed, right? Let's look around you. Look in your family community and see what greed does, right? And so greed was the premium fuel that drove transatlantic slaving, and for the most part, that was driven by a staple or set of stimulants. Tobacco is a stimulant. The liquors, the rums, right, is a stimulant, right? The molasses and sugar are stimulants, right? The cocoa, of course, later added with milk and sugar, to make the sort of chocolate that we're accustomed to, a stimulant. These are all stimulants, right? And so greed for stimulants drove it, and it's what, a smaller group of people, not in the millions, right? Perhaps in the tens of thousands, including African rulers, merchants, and people who were under either their willing governance or directions, or driven by their own sense of greed or survival, that led those raids, that joined those parties to war, and of course the spoils of both ended up enslaving. So is it really God, or is it the greed or the spirit of greed, the spirit of wanting things that you deem to be symbolic or otherwise important and valuable, and that people are less valuable compared to that desire for things? That is vanity, right? And so the spirit of vanity, the spirit of greed, is really at stake there. And guess what? Living amongst us human beings are a lot of people who are not people, right? You may refer to them as evil spirits or demons that take on human form. I don't mean things out of the movie. I mean, there are people living among us that are ruthless. And I'll give you a very close to home example. Speaking to a friend recently, that our greatest enemies are the people that we're told are families, right? And there's a faulty premise there. Just because somebody comes through the same womb doesn't mean they're family, right? Notice that the danger and harm that people will experience will less likely be by a stranger and more by a family member, an uncle, an aunt, a mother, a father, a sibling, right? So whether it's maiming, harming, or killing, right? It's usually, most of the cases, among people that we're told related by blood, in many cases, if not by other means, right? So it's not God, right? It's the spirit, of something driving us, in us. And so there are people among us, that are just simply demons, right? That is, they're malevolent spiritual forces, beings, right? That can take on the shape of a human body, and that's not very difficult, right? And they walk among us. One of the ways you can tell is that people of that kind and character don't cast a shadow. And so if you can't find somebody's shadow readily, then they're that. But then, of course, there's some that are more clever than that. But they live among us, right? Because the demon is not simply just some fiction or science fiction, creature that you see maybe in a movie or in a novel, or on the TV screen, but it is the spirit, right, that lives in many of us, right? And some of us are able to exercise, some of us not. And so is it God, or is it these demons, essentially populating and essentially recruiting more? Notice that whenever you're on the cusp of a breakthrough, of a blessing in your life, that everything seems to go wrong. That's not God, right? That's the other side, the other team, right? Again, binary forces. And, those particular forces, they want more recruits. And so by sabotaging, undermining, putting ideas in your head, putting sometimes words in your head and words in your mouth, excuse me, they are able to what? Disrupt. And then who you blame? You blame God. You say, well, God did this. If God was good, then why don't I have goodness, right? Well, there are other forces that exist, and they want to recruit you to their camp. And so the best way to do that is is basically have this war against, the forces of, for lack of a better term, of goodness. And therefore, you say, well, you know what, you revolt. And in that revolt, you give, the other team the upper hand in essentially using you and handling you, and then you become an instrument of that team. It's really that simple, right? And it has wide-ranging effects. Let me give you some stats to make it plain. You might be surprised of all the airplanes or aerial accidents happening, this year so far. We're only in March, right? I think we're in mid-March. And what's not surprising is this. We have stats. The AVA keeps statistics about this. And so January, I think, 2023, there were about maybe 70 of these air accidents. Most, not all, being fatal. In 2024, I think they were in the 50s, high 50s, maybe 58. And then, check this out. As of February 25th, 2025 of this year, 99. And you might think, well, what accounts for this? Well, let me give another stat. Between 2004 and 2025, the number of aerial fatalities, the number of aerial accidents, have been going down. But in that wide range, they have increased. So even though they're going down, in terms of aggregate number, they've been increasing steadily over that period. And what I'm getting at is that we live in a world where there are other forces and players that are much more powerful, much more integral, to this world that can't be seen, but they act in this world. And so the pulling down these planes are not simply because of mechanical failure. And in most cases, it's not. Even if it comes out that way, ultimately, in terms of people have to find something to blame. But often the answer is not in the physical, much like an autopsy. You got to find something, if you're a coroner, to say cause of death. But ultimately, no one knows the cause of death, right? Because the cause of death is not, in the physical. But they have to say some organ failed or this happened in terms of a material or physical analysis. They have to put something down on the record, right? But they don't know the cause of death. Keyword cause, not the anatomical result of death. There's a difference. The same thing for these planes, right? The black box may tell you that the plane went down at this point in time and perhaps there was a failure of something, but what caused that failure, right? So I'm not trying to scare you from flying, and I fly all the time. But what I'm trying to say is that there are forces that exist, and it's as real, right? that there is a battle between these binary forces that are ongoing. And though we can't see them, we can see the manifestations of those forces. And so by deduction, by working backwards, by reverse engineering, you can say, well, there are these forces existing, and they do play a important role. I'll give another example in terms of some statistics, because you might like numbers, right? Some hard data, right? Think about the kinds of governments, right? Because there's a new president in the United States, and around the world you have elections that are either about to happen or has recently been called, right? There are 88, actually a few years ago, I think this stat is from 2023, right? So it's maybe more as of this recording. There are 88 autocracies. Autocracies are these ruling countries by an individual, which could take the form of a dictatorship or as a elected or absolute monarchy. But autocratic is essentially run by a single person, right? sort of an authoritarian rule. Right, even if there is elected officials, they're saying they bow down to or they fall to the dictates of a single individual, sometimes a single party. Right, nonetheless, there are 88 autocracies counted as of a few years ago, and that 88, right, accounts for 70% of the population in the world. I'll say it again, 70%. That's 3/4. In other words, 3/4 of the world are under some form of autocratic rule, right? And including the United States. I'll explain it very simply. The United States has what? 3 branches of government, right? And they have 2 major parties, Democrats, Republicans. And of course, there's something vaguely called independent, but we'll put them to the side because they're, enigmatic. And so there are 3 branches of government: judiciary, right? Legislature, they make the law; judiciary interpret the laws; and of course, executive branch, which is the president, that essentially signs off, on these laws, right? And so the legislature is controlled by the Republicans, both houses, that is the House and the Senate. That's one, check. The executive, Republican, check. Judiciary, Supreme Court. Now, supposedly this branch is non-political, but guess what? Presidents who are political appoint them, which means that the Supreme Court, are political. And the balance between democratically appointed and Republican appointed justices are clearly in the Republican side. So there you have all 3 branches of government under one party rule, authoritarian rule, right? And guess what? There's a recent Pew Research Center poll that was done, of folks, maybe a month or so after the election results and the taking of office in January. And they found that 41%, that's 9 points from half the country, agrees with authoritarian rule. Check that out, right? What am I getting at? What does, spirituality and God to do with it? Everything. You see, people blame election results. They blame the kind of quality of life they have based upon, how they're governed and ruled and misgoverned, on, why me, why us, the world is going to hell, etc., and so on, right? And all of those explanations and theories are far from fetched. The world is becoming more authoritarian because there's a spirit of what? Of net negative forces that are gaining more and more traction, more adherents, more believers, more members to that camp, more members, on that team, right? And as the membership grows, so does that reflect in the kind of governance that happens in terms of, people's lives, right? And so the spike in authoritarian rule, the spike in the pushback against, rule by the people, rule of law, which means little nothing nowadays. Money talks, on these matters, right? And so those all reflect when people try to explain them or try to, essentially figure out, why this is happening to them. They blame, God, right? And this is about those forces battling, right? In fact, as I make this recording, these wars are going on between those forces in a way that you can't see, but they affect us in very clear ways, which I've laid out previously in this video, right? They manifest in those ways. And therefore, I'm going to end with this. Indeed, the force or the spirit of God, because God is not necessarily a race, it's not a gender, it's a spirit. It has to be being so all-encompassing and so integral and so invested in everything and everywhere at every time, right? It has to be. And as such, that power, that presence, easily can be blamed. But at the same time, I'll say this to you. In my experience, God expresses itself, as a very gentle and soft voice. In our minds, we will hear a voice that would tell us, do this, do that, or what about this, or what about that? And if it's not soft and gentle, right, it's not God. God is guilt. It will make us feel something about what we did that was wrong, right? The force of wickedness and evil or of the demon or demonic world doesn't give you, it's the opposite of guilt. It makes you feel good. The same way we feel good about stomping out the life of a roach or a small creature. We feel great about that, or hurting someone. That's the other force. God is guilt. God is conscience, right? God is that soft voice we hear. Don't do that, or do you really want to do that, right? And you may back away. That's God, right? And I know in my experience, God is fair, right? The Creator is fair, right? I didn't fully appreciate that until recently. It's fair, right? It's fair. And the more we reject and walk away, and therefore become a part of the other team, the more the other team has what? An effect in our lives, not God. But Baba Nyame, I've been your guide and host for this episode and many more. Please put your comments in the section below, and your questions and queries and thoughts and your experiences as much as you're care to share. And as usual, I respond to all of them in due course. Until next time, you all stay well, be blessed, take care.